It's my great honor to introduce George Lakoff. It's a great honor to have you at our cognitive science department. George Lakoff is a professor of cognitive science and linguistics at the University of California at Berkeley. And I think it's fair to say that for more than 3 decades now, he has made a major impact on cognitive science. And he's really one of the few cognitive scientists who have been very successful in reaching out to the general public as well. So, George Lakoff may be best known for his work on metaphor and embodiment. So his books Metaphors We Live By, Women, Fire and Dangerous Things have really provided a new understanding of metaphor. And then his books Philosophy in the Flesh and Where Mathematics Come From were important milestones in the cognitive science of embodiment, which is making cognitive scientists realize that human thinking is embodied. Recently, George Lakoff has become increasingly interested in Europolitics, the topic of his lecture in the auditorium today. And he will give us today a general overview, he announced that, of his new Cascade theory that fleshes out yesterday's lectures. So please join me in welcoming him at the Cascade department.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you all for coming. This is an amazing audience. I thought there would be like 12 people. So, I also want to warn you, this is the first lecture on an incomplete manuscript. This is the first 100 pages of, I don't know how many pages it will be. But this is not a lecture I've ever given before. So you should be warned about that. Let me start with a little bit of the history, at least in my involvement, in the study of embodied cognition, and then later on in the study of neural cognition. Can you all hear? Is this okay in back? Good. By the way, are there seats? There are people coming in. I want to make sure everybody has a seat. Are there any open seats around? Well, then come on up front and sit on the floor and enjoy yourselves. I mean, come on up here. There's some room in the floor. I want everybody to be as comfortable as possible. Look, back in 1975, I got a small grant from the National Science Foundation to run a summer seminar for 8 people, and 188 showed up. And so what we did when people started showing up is my research assistant, Ivan Sog, rented out sorority houses at Berkeley to form communes for these people and so on. And we decided to have an institute rather than just a summer seminar. And the rules of the institute were very simple. Anybody could talk as long as they came to me and put their name on a schedule 3 days in advance, picked out an hour, and we had a couple of rooms. And then there were hundreds of talks. Now, there were several of them that were really, really important historically. One of them was by Paul Kay, who is an anthropologist working on color. And he talked about the work that he was doing on color terms around the world, but as it related to the work in neuroscience on the neurophysiology of color vision. And he pointed out to us that something that anybody who studies color from the neural perspective knows, that there are no colors in the world. There's no green in grass, no blue in the sky, no red in blood. Colors are created by, one, there are wavelength reflectances, but wavelengths are not colors. There are detectors in the eye, that is the color cones. There are 3 types for normal folks, 4 types for some women, a small percentage, and if you're colorblind, you have fewer than 3. And then there are neural connections between these color cones and the rest of the brain that produce colors. And it's the neural circuitry, together with all of this, that produces color. Color is an interactive property between you and the world. There are no colors there. Okay? So every time you look at a beautiful scene outside, you look out here at all, at trees, at colors, and so on, you are helping to create this. And not only that, men and women differ because the color cones have to do with the biological differences at the level of the cell. So it turns out that there are 2 types of color cones for men and 16 types for women. And so if you have ever had an argument with someone of the opposite gender about whether something is blue or green or brown or orange and so on, you are both right because you have different cones, okay? And you're creating color in somewhat different ways. This is not something that's an objective thing that you say, yes, it is definitely blue, not green. So that's a very important thing to understand in all of this. So Paul pointed that out and talked about the role of neuroscience in color, which is important because color shows up in language. And the theory was that language fit the world directly, that there was an objective view of the world and that language would just fit it, and that blue would name something directly out there in the world, and it doesn't. The next talk that was really important was given by Eleanor Rosch, a great psychologist, who observed that categories are not just simply hierarchical, that from a conceptual point of view, certain categories are more basic than others, basic in the following sense, that there's a sort of middle level. So you have a hierarchy of categories like furniture, chair, rocking chair, or vehicle, car, sports car. Turns out the ones in the middle, car and chair, have special properties. You can get a mental image of a car. Get a mental image of a car. You cannot get a mental image of a generalized vehicle that is neutral between cars, planes, trains, and boats. You can get a mental image of a chair. No problem. You cannot get a mental image of a generalized piece of furniture that is neutral between chairs, beds, tables, and lamps. Right? Doesn't work. That is, what was hypothesized there, now we understand it, and we'll talk about that momentarily, is that, and also you can pick out things at the basic level very quickly in terms of Gestalt perception, and you have more knowledge of things at that level. What she pointed out was that categories are embodied, and different categories and different levels are embodied in different ways. That was revolutionary in 1975. Right? A very, very important discovery. So that was number 2. Both of them said that concepts are embodied. The third also said the same thing. This was a wonderful talk by Leonard Talmy, who has just retired as chair of cognitive science at the State University of Buffalo. He was then a grad student at Berkeley. And he had finished a dissertation on spatial cognition in languages around the world. And he came to a conclusion, which Ronald Laniker independently at UCSD came to the same conclusion independently. He came to the conclusion that if you look at languages, even that are very close, they have very different spatial systems. So Dutch and English look really different. German and English look different. French and English look different. The words for the prepositions work very, very differently. However, what he pointed out was that they broke down into primitives that were the same, that they were different combinations of the same things. And then he went over what those primitives were that he was found. He particularly did Native American languages and was studying how the Native American system works, which is unlike anything in European languages. And he pointed out that you have concepts like containments, things that are in a bounded region, an interior, exterior, and a boundary. Like the room is a container, but the face of that clock is a container, and this bottle is a container. They have topological properties of containment that are independent of size, they're independent of location, they're independent of shape, but they have a certain topology. Okay? And he said, look, this is how this really works in this way, and we get words like in and out and so on, dependent on things like that. And he then pointed out you also have things based on motion. So you have a source, a past, and a goal, a to, a from, but then you have particular kinds of motion in different languages. You have along, which has to do with having going beside something that is long and is within and is close to it. You have notions like near and far, and sometimes very far in various languages. So nearness is one thing, motion is one thing, but then he pointed out, some years later, he observed that when you have a verb of motion, something that is that can be a road or a path or some object, it uses the verb of motion to trace that motion. So you have things like the road runs through the forest, runs through, goes along the coast, as if you use the word goes. And since then, we have a marvelous experimental verification of the reality of this mentally from Teenie Matlock, who is chair of cognitive science at the University of California in the Central Valley. And what she pointed out experimentally was that if you take a difference between the road runs through the valley and the road meanders through the valley, it takes longer to understand meander because you are tracing it in your mind. You're tracing the path, even though the road is just sitting there, right? You're understanding it in terms of motion. So this is, again, part of embodied cognition that we have. And what they've done is shown that there are lots of things of this sort. These are called image schemas. They structure several things. They structure what you see. They structure how you move and how you can move in the world. And they are the same whether you actually are blind from birth or not. Because most people who are blind from birth have a problem between here, the retina, and V1, and the rest of the brain is intact. And these things have to do with the rest of the brain between the links between what you see and your motion. Because the parietal cortex is connected to the premotor cortex that links those up in the brain. So, you know, what you're doing in the world is related to what you see, and the same image schemas are used for both of them. And then this became really dramatic in works by Srini Narayanan back in 1992. Srini Narayanan was then a first-year graduate student who had just arrived from India, where he was a specialist in computer science, mathematics, physiology, neurophysiology, spoke 7 languages, classical literature, and economics. He was a typical Indian education. So he arrived from the Indian Institute of Technology, and he took on a project that one of his cohorts was working on, which was how you could get a computer simulation. They had a computer simulation of a body, right? They're trying to figure out how you could learn in various languages words for hand motion, because it's different in different languages. We have push the button and push the baby carriages, but there are different verbs in Spanish and other languages for all of the things that you can do with your hand. And the idea is this should have something to do with the way the hand works. And to model that computationally, and we were working in a neural computation lab, they needed to have a body online. Luckily, there was a body online at the University of Pennsylvania. Its name was Jack. And the body had been constructed for testing car crashes. So they had every bone and muscle and so on there, but it didn't move. So the question is, how can you get this body to actually move and do the right things? You put in push with a little block, and would it push the block? Pull, would it pull the block? You know, how would it work? How would you get this body to do stuff? So Srini took up this problem and found that there was a set of computational tools that could be changed to make it look very neural, to bring it very close to how the neural system worked. And being a very good computer scientist, he changed it, fixed it up, and so on, and invented, therefore, a different form of neural computation. And he was able to do this. And he modeled these things. And then he noticed something about it that he reported in our lab. He noticed that in doing it, there were 2 levels. there was one level that was basically the same for all the different kinds of motions, and that another level which picked out different arms and legs and stuff for doing things. So the part that was the same had to do with things like this. If I am going to take a drink of water, I have to be close enough to pick it up. So there's a precondition. I have to start to do it, which means I have to move my arm, but that has to be choreographed by the premotor cortex going to the motor cortex. Motor cortex can only do things like this and that and this and that and this and that. But you have to coordinate all of them through premotor. So you have to model the premotor cortex to do this. So then you have to start to do it, then you have to pick it up, and you have a goal. My goal is, I'm thirsty, I need a drink. And the central part is drinking. And then I ask, there's a goal, have I reached my goal? No, I'm still thirsty. Hey, yes, I'm not thirsty anymore. Now I can put it down, so on. When I am in the middle of it, I am drinking. After it, I have drunk. Before it, I'm about to drink. Okay? English has a way to express the different parts of this action structure. Every language has a way to express it in various ways. All around the world, the same structure occurs. It's called aspect, and every language can do it. But what's interesting is that the same neural system that will run the body, that will have you actually do it, that neural system has exactly the right structure for the language and for the understanding. And then he worked out the logic of it. No one had worked out the logic of aspect. He then pointed out that the computer program had in it the way to do all the logical inferences about aspect. Hi, come on in. We have room on the floor. Come and have a seat. Okay? Don't be shy. Come on. So, a remarkable thing. Another example of the embodiment of concepts and cognition. And this was done via neural computation. Now, then we got another great student, his name was Terry Regier, who had been studying the biology of the brain and psychophysics and cognitive linguistics and neural computation in his first year at Berkeley. You know, that's what a first year at Berkeley student in Cog Sci does. And so he comes in and he studies these things, a very, very good computer scientist, and we get him working on our project. And he takes up the problem of prepositions in English and six languages. He happens to be fluent in English, Arabic, and Russian. Now, another one of these typical Berkeley grad students. It's very imposing to me to meet our graduate students. I get overwhelmed by them sometimes. They're very, very smart. Now, so he comes in and he says, okay, how does this work in the brain? Well, we know the following things. We know that throughout the brain there are things called topographic maps. So we have a topographic map of the visual field. Well, what's a topographic map? Say in the visual cortex, come on in, grab a seat. Yeah. A topographic map in the visual field is, let's say, in the back here, you have neurons coming out of the retina. They go through the LGN and they go to the back. And the ones that are next to each other in the retina wind up having connections that are next to each other back here. Not in exactly the same location, but they preserve closeness. And this is not a miracle. It's been studied. People have actually looked at cat embryos, and they can actually see the axons growing to exactly the right spot. They try to land in V1. They say, oh, over here, maybe over here. Nope, not quite yet. Ah, just right, land here. The guy next to it comes over and says, ah, just right, land there. And it turns out this is not a miracle, it's chemistry. Coming out of the eye, you get an extrusion of two chemicals at various angles. And it's sort of like getting two numbers that, like in a Cartesian plane. So you get two chemicals, and back here you have two chemicals that bind to them. Only they're at a slightly different angle, and you're going to bind back here, and you will get things that are preserve closeness. But it's not just here, it's throughout the whole brain and body. That is, you have topographic maps in layers in the brain that are connected in this way. and then they go from here to various other parts of the brain, to the parietal cortex, and they extend to the motor cortex. You have a map of your whole body in the motor cortex, a topographic map of your whole body in the sensory cortex, and for sensing things throughout the body, in the somatosensory cortex, and maps throughout the parietal cortex of the visual field. Now, Mike Singer, who works at Berkeley in the vision science department, does work on monkeys, and what he's been able to find, for example, he can isolate topographic maps here that pick out motion. And he's got a sequence of 7 of them that do somewhat different things, so that when they shine a light across this, you can actually see pick out the activation across each of these maps. And they're somewhat different. He doesn't yet know exactly what the difference is. But what Terry did was the following. He asked the following. He said, if I were God, and I had invented this body with all of these maps, and I wanted to get them to understand spatial relations, how would I arrange the maps to do it? In other words, he's saying, can we get a theory of how the maps are connected to do things like this? And what he pointed out was that if you do the right connections across the maps of normal connections that we know exist on independent grounds, you can actually compute containment, motion, lines, motion around things, and so on. Namely, you can compute all the image schemas from combinations of maps. And what people are doing now is trying to work out the details of what those combinations of maps look like and what the connections are across it. The point is, these things are embodied. Your understanding of space is embodied. And then you have another problem. Suppose I want to pour water into the glass. I have the water, here's the glass. I can pour it into this glass, out of the bottle. You all see that? No problem. How can you possibly understand this? Because the containment of the glass is in one set of topographic maps, and motion is in a different one. They're not in the same place in the brain. How can you possibly understand that this is going from here to that? And you all do, instantly, every person does. Monkeys do it, everybody does this. How do you do it? And how do you do it particularly knowing that the goal of the motion is the interior of this container, the source is the exterior, and if I poured this back out, it would be the reverse. You have words like in, into, and out of. How do you understand into when what you have is where you have 2 different schemas, one that has an interior, an exterior, and a boundary, and the other has a source, a path, and a goal, and you know for in that the goal is bound to the interior and the source to the exterior. How do you do that in a brain where nothing moves? And the answer is neural binding. There are circuits that do that. Well, what kind of circuits would work? And how do you have them there? So to answer this question, you need to know a little bit more about the most elementary neuroscience. I'm not going to do anything fancy today. The most elementary, what you would learn in the first week or 2 of a neuroscience course. When you're born, you have 100 billion neurons. Each of them has about 1,000 to 10,000 connections, inputs and outputs. That gives you about a quadrillion connections. By the time you're about 5, half of them die, and it's the half that are not used. The ones that are used structure your brain in a very important way. A lot of what you learn in life, you have learned before you're 5 years old. That's why early childhood education is crucial. Now, given that leaves only a half a quadrillion connections. That's more than enough to understand most things. So you have a whole lot of neural connections and neurons that are firing, that are connected to other, that are firing at base rate, but aren't in significant circuits to do anything. Now, it's important to understand that all these ideas, like image schemas and frames and metaphors and so on are brain circuits. They're circuits that are there physically in your brain. You can't think of anything that isn't physical. All thought is physical. And so, you know, you have learned by the time you're 5 years old a whole lot of concepts. I mean, I have a granddaughter who's approaching 4, and when she was 2, she was correcting me. You know, their kids learn very, very quickly, very early, all kinds of things very fast. And, you know, as a 4-year-old, she is something. Now, you know, when I was a 4 years old, my mother had taught me arithmetic, and I was taken to the store to check the addition of the person who was writing it down on the bag, who was always trying to cheat her, right? So my job was to catch the cheating, right? But, you know, 4-year-olds can know a whole lot of stuff. Now, they've learned this automatically. How have they learned anything at all? Unconsciously, because 98% of your thought is unconscious. How have they learned it? By neural recruitment. Here's what neural recruitment is. When you have a certain structure in your brain that partly you've gotten, even in the womb, you're learning to move your arms and legs and touch things and so on. So some structures are there. As you're learning, you activate certain parts of the brain, and the more you activate them, the stronger the synapses get. And we can tell you what that is in a minute, which you'll have to do. Then they get stronger, and as they get strong enough, they form permanent circuits that are there. And then when you learn something new, the easiest way to learn it is to learn it relative to the circuits that are already there, and that is to recruit circuits of those 500 quadrillion that are around that could compute the right ideas, but that aren't doing anything right now. And those circuits then are recruited. Recruitment means they're used, and when they're used, the synapses get stronger and eventually permanent. So that's basically how you learn stuff. Now, so what's going on in this, if you got into, you have to have connections in your brain that would link the in and the to. What do those connections have to be? They're called neural binding connections, and they link the interior of the computed by the containment schema to the goal of the source path goal schema. So you've got two schemas, and they have a structure of the following form. There is a whole schema, source path goal, with 3 semantic roles, source, path, and goal, computed in different topographic maps. And what you have is the binding between those 2 maps and circuits that connect to each map. And we'll talk about the structure of those circuits in a minute. But you have to be able to say that the interior and the goal are firing at the same rate in such a way that the rest of the brain cannot tell the difference if they're bound together. There's a piece here and a piece there that are identical, but you can't bring them together. So that means there's a circuit that says you're going to fire in both directions, and they're going to be firing at the same rate so that the rest of the brain can't tell which is which. And that means they're identical. Now, how does that happen? Because you can separate out in and to. You can use them separately, so that this binding doesn't always happen. In order to make it happen and not happen, you have to have what's called a neural gate. What is a neural gate? Neural gate is made up of a very simple kind of circuitry. It's either a neuron or a neural ensemble, which has axons that go into some of the synapses along this dual pathway. And when they go in there, what happens is this. When they're firing at a normal rate, these gates, which are called modulators, these gates will put out a certain amount of neurotransmitter, but not enough to allow transmission to happen. And I'll tell you what those neurotransmitters do in a minute that will allow that. When they're firing at a stronger rate, they put out more neurotransmitters, which allow the transmission to happen. So that if the gate is active and you have this circuit, then you can get an into. and you understand into. And you can recruit that because there's enough neural circuitry left over from that half a quadrillion that they're around all over the place. And if you can learn it, the circuitry is there. You can't learn anything unless there are neural circuits, there are potential neural circuits, that is neural connections, there in advance. They don't just come out of thin air. You don't say, oh, let's have a neural circuit, we're going to conjure one up. Doesn't happen. It's got to be there, earlier. So it all works by recruitment, but you have lots of them all over the place that are just alive but not doing much. And then you recruit more. So that is how neural binding works. Now, that's pretty cool. And what we're doing is then looking at all the cases where you have concepts that have parts like in and to, that then can be bound together. That's what cognitive linguists do. We study those things. Now, let's stop for a minute and let this sink in. Why? Because think about all that we just saw. You think with your brain. Now, most of it is unconscious. Why? Could all of your thought be conscious? No. Why couldn't it? Because consciousness is linear, goes linearly, and the brain, in terms of the circuitry it has, is parallel. It has thousands of parallel connections going to all sorts of parts of the brain, like to and in and the bindings between them, and all sorts of other things. If you listen to me talk or you think yourself, any ideas that you have, any conversation you're in, the activity is really strong, going very, very fast, unconsciously in all sorts of directions. The linear structure of consciousness could not possibly keep track of thousands of connections. There's no way that you could be conscious of most of your thought. Think about that for a minute. Also, when you make a conscious decision, your brain is doing it a half a second before, unconsciously. You are your cognitive unconscious with an overlay of things you're conscious of. And most of it you don't know about. That is awesome. And that provokes our field. Our field is to make the unconscious conscious. It is to show what the neural circuitry is like and how particular ideas are there. Not just random ideas, but how you would actually get things like in and to and into out of the right neural circuitry. That's what, a neural cognitive linguistics does. Cognitive linguistics studies the concepts and their structure, add the neural to that, and it's saying, how does the neural system do it so that it's embodied? Okay? That's what this is, what we're doing. That's what's in the first part of this thing, in about the first half of it. Now, to do this, there are a lot of other things you have to know. First, there are frames, which are combinations of schemas, of these image schemas that we have. Frames have structure. Let me first tell you a little bit about frames. I'll give you some examples and talk about their structure. There's a simple one that Chuck Fillmore first pointed out in his first lecture, that in 1975, the fourth lecture was Fillmore's. And Fillmore pointed out that every word in every language is defined relative to a frame. That if you take a word like waiter or menu or dish or something like that, you're going to evoke a restaurant frame. What's in a restaurant frame? Well, you go to a restaurant, what do you expect? You expect a maitre d' perhaps to seat you at a table. You expect a waiter to come over and give you a menu and to take your order. You expect food to be prepared and delivered to your table. You expect to eat it, to get a bill, pay it, etc. There's a scenario that you expect, and the elements of those scenario are called semantic roles. the waiter, the menu, the food, etc., semantic role, and you have a semantic role. You are the customer. But this restaurant frame, which you all have, by the way, how many frames do you have in your head? Tens of thousands. Lots. Anytime you have any institution or situation that is conventional, that you know about, you have a frame for it. You know what the elements are, you know what happens in it, and you know what doesn't happen in it. So if something weird is happening in a restaurant, it doesn't fit the frame. A herd of elephants come through, it's not part of the restaurant frame. Okay? In the middle of your dinner, they wheel in a patient to be operated on your table, and they hand you the scalpel. That's not in the restaurant frame. You may happen to be a surgeon, but it's also not in the surgery frame because it's in the restaurant while you're eating dinner. Right? It doesn't work. These are separate frames. And the point of this is the following. That restaurant frame is made up of three other frames. Three other frames are the food service frame, which you can do at your home when you invite someone to dinner. The business frame, there are all kinds of businesses. And the host-guest frame. And in this, when you go to the restaurant, you are the guest, you are the eater, and you are the customer. And they are bound together. And that means neural bindings between those three frames in different parts of the brain. They have to all be bound together. And when they are bound together by a neural binding circuitry, you get a restaurant. And when they're not bound together, you get separate businesses and food service and hosts and guests. Okay? So the idea is you can put these things together or not. And that gives a hierarchical structure, which is a very important kind of structure. So you have that. Now, one of the interesting things about these cases is that all words are defined with respect to them. You say waiter, and the whole restaurant frame comes up. Okay? So this is important. And then there's a commercial event frame, which has to do with the business. In a commercial event frame, what do you have? You have a buyer, seller, goods, and money. In the restaurant frame, the goods is the food, and the money is what you pay for it, and the buyer is you, the customer, and the seller is the restaurant. Okay? Pretty straightforward. But in the basic frame for that, where you just buy something and they give you money, in that most prototypical frame, that has a structure too. It breaks down into the basic image schemas. Because one of the things you're doing is you are having an exchange. You're exchanging goods for money. But then, what is an exchange? An exchange is a mutual giving. One person gives you that, the other person gives you that. It's mutual with bindings across it. So that I give you the money, you give me the food or whatever that I'm getting from you, the goods, the book. And, but I and you have to be fixed. They have to be bound together. Right? So there are bindings of these frames. And then giving is made up of various image schemas. A causal schema, which is exerting a force on something to move, and it's something that moves from one location to another location. And at those locations, there is possession. So you have a possession schema. And when a possession schema is made up of, in physical cases, of two things. It's made up of the physical location and control. Now, then you get metaphorical extensions where possessions can be stocks, they can be all kinds of other things, right? Which extend the physical cases to non-physical cases. And then you have a huge numbers of metaphors. So what's a metaphor? Metaphor is a map from frame to frame or schema to schema. So those occur all the time, and you're constantly doing that. So again, I pour more water in the glass, the level goes up every time, more is up, less is down. And we have a metaphor, more is up, less is down, prices rise or fall. They apply to prices, they apply to temperatures. The heat went up, turn the heat down, and so on. Now, why does that work? How does it work neurally that you get what's called a primary metaphor? How does the brain do such things? If you're held affectionately as a child, you feel affection and bodily warmth. Then you get a metaphor that affection is warmth. Someone can be a warm person, a cold person, etc. And then you say, how do you know this? Is there any studies, psychological studies? And the answer is yes, for affection is warmth. For example, here's a case. In Toronto, they had cases where people were asked to tell stories about when people really liked them and greeted them warmly and so on. Tell something from your past. And the other one, other subjects were asked to tell stories when they were snubbed and people snubbed them. Okay? And then on the way out, they asked another question. They said, oh, how warm do you think the room is? The ones who were told nice stories thought the room was 5 degrees warmer than the other guys, on the average. Okay? And there are other experiments like this all over the place. I can go through them. But there's a wonderful book of these experiments that show that the metaphor stuff is real. It's a book called Louder Than Words, as in actions speak louder than words, by Benjamin Bergen, a professor at University of California, San Diego. And it's a magnificent book. It has 200 experiments, beautifully described and funny. So if you like to read a book that's easy to read, beautiful and funny, pick up Louder Than Words, and you'll learn a huge amount about embodied cognition, because he goes through all the relevant experiments. Now, what this shows is that all this stuff is neurally real. And when you're learning something like affection is warmth, how does that work? Well, you're held affectionately, you feel affection, and you feel bodily warmth in different parts of your brain. And they know what parts those are. It turns out they're different sides of the insula. And they can figure out what's being active there. And what you're learning, as they both active, you get spreading activation that goes through the rest of the brain, finds the shortest circuit between them, and that forms a circuit. That circuit is the metaphor. But then the circuit is asymmetric. If you look at the circuit that's going out, it looks symmetric. How do you get asymmetry? And the answer is a low-level fact about neural systems called spike time dependent plasticity. Okay? Let me explain what that is. Very simple, right? Let each hand be a neuron. Let each finger be an axon. When they're going in different directions, they impinge on each axon impinges on the cell body of the other. Got it? Now, the one that normally fires first gets strengthened and has the synapse strengthened in its direction, and the other has the synapse weakened in the other direction. So this is what happens. You get affection is warmth coming together, affection and warmth. Why is it affection is warmth, not warmth is affection? Because the brain is always computing temperature, whether you're asleep or awake, but the brain is not always computing affection. So you get more activation in one direction than another, and that is determining the directionality of the metaphor. And that shows up in language secondarily. It's a conceptual metaphor, and it shows up in different kinds of language, different particular words. Now, those metaphors, which are primary like that, come about by the 100. There are lots of experiences we have where different parts of the brain are activated together, and they give rise to primary metaphors, and many of those experiences are universal, and therefore many of the metaphors show up in all cultures. Okay? It turns out that affection and warmth shows up in many cultures, but not all. It does not show up in equatorial India. It's not there in Tamil. Okay? In Tamil, annoyance is warmth because it's very hot. It's 120 degrees. Now, but around the world, in many places, you have that. More is up, universal. Not necessarily in the words of the language, but in the ideas, and they can be learned very easily. Now, the rest of the metaphor system has to do with binding between the metaphors, bringing the metaphors together. The metaphors are neural circuits linking frame circuits, and they are can be bound to do each other to different frames. And in general, most interesting concepts have lots and lots of metaphors that are different components. You know, if you're looking at government or economics or something like that, it's very complicated. When you actually break down the metaphor structure into all the component schemas that are embodied, you get a very, very complicated structure, and it's a neural structure. In there, binding is crucial. You're binding across the metaphors, but there's another thing that's crucial, and that is cascades. So let me talk to you very briefly about what is a cascade. Now, there's a beautiful description of this in a book called Reading in the Brain by Stanislas Dehaene, who is one of the great neuroscientists in the world. He's in the Collège de France and deserves to be in the Collège de France. And the book is great. And what he describes is, it's about letters. It says, how can you read? We didn't evolve to read. How the hell can we read? And do numbers and letters, when we see them, we might have something like a sort of block S that looks like a 5. Are those recognized as numbers and letters in different parts of the brain? The answer is yes. He studied numbers, and he said, well, it turns out numbers are mainly activated over here and letters over there. How does this happen? And secondly, you can recognize the numbers, or you can imagine them. And when you imagine them, you get activation in the brain all the way down to the primary visual cortex. How does that happen? How is any of this at all possible? How can you recognize any letter at all? And what is it that we learned in evolution that allows us to do this? And he shows that they are what are called primitive, simple cascades. The cascades we're going to look at are more complicated. But let's start with the simple ones. Here's how they go. You know from before that from the retina, you have topographic maps here. So if you see something that's there, it's in the retina, that has this shape, there's a corresponding set of neurons over here that have those shapes next to each other, but they're just individual neurons. That part of the brain can't recognize a shape. So how the hell do you recognize a shape? So what happens is this. There's another layer next to that. And that layer recognizes center surround receptive fields. What is a center surround receptive field? Okay? It has to do with the fact that you can see things better if there's a contrast than if there isn't. So it turns out that over here, if you have something that is lit up here and it's dark around it, you can see it better than if it isn't dark around it. So in here you have this lit up thing being activated, and if something is dark around it, you have something that's inhibiting something around it. So that what's going on is there's another layer that that is lined up. Here you have two bunches of neurons like this. This neuron is connected to that one, that corresponding one. And then the ones that are around it inhibit this center surround receptive field. So that what happens is that if this is strong and those are weak, then you get this activated and otherwise. So you have these things that you activate the center and you inhibit the surround. And you have connections from the surround and the activation to inhibiting connections from the surround, activating from the center to the next neuron next to it, all over the place. Okay, that's layer number 2. And that has to do with seeing contrasts. But that is then used in layer number 3. In layer number 3, you get little lines. That is, you overlap the centers. And when you overlap a bunch of centers, one after another, you get a line, a little line. Now, how do you know that it's a line? Because in layer number 3, the connections from those centers goes to a single neuron over there that tells you that's a line. That's what a line means. You have this. And it turns out that in layer number 3, there are what are called columns of neurons, that is superimposition of these things. At each point, there are 16 orientations of lines, like that, which means there are 16 combinations of neurons coming to different neurons that are overlapping each other at each point, so that you can see lines in different orientations. And if there's a line in between, it works, there's partial activation of each, because with partial activation you're going to get activation that looks like a little bell curve, and it's going to be active in the middle. Then, to get longer lines at the next level, you are getting the lines connected, and you can have longer lines. So you have about 4 layers so far. But then there's the question of when do the lines intersect, and what is an intersection? An intersection is where there's another layer, and you have the lines come in at a certain level of activation, but where there's an intersection, you get a higher level of activation. And the neurons in the next layer are active when there's an intersection at a given place. It says these lines intersect here. And the combinations of those intersections are then put together in another layer that says, hey, that's an F or an S or a T. And then, but that only tells you the shape. It doesn't say it's a letter versus a number, because then for numbers you have circuitry that takes it to one part of the brain that says, hey, this is the number 5 versus 4, and other things go over here that says, hey, this is an S versus an F. Okay? Now, it turns out that all these connections go in both directions, because you can imagine an S or an F or a T, and when that happens, it's active all the way down, and neuroscientists have traced the connections going in both directions. That is a cascade, a simple cascade. That is, to understand anything like the structure of an F, it's got to put all that information together. Locally, there's only nothing happening, hardly. A bunch of neurons are connected to a bunch of other neurons. When you put them together in a cascade, you get a letter. Okay? It turns out meaning works the same way. That is, so let me give you complicated cases. Take a word like over. Now, in a book called Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, there's a chapter on over. Over in English has over 100 meanings. In there, we only looked at 60 of them. And some of them are metaphorical, some of them are image schematic. And what we did was we showed how they basically work, but we left out something there. We left out their grammar. So let's take a simple case. He walked over the hill. It's above and across. You know, he walked over the bridge. It's above and across. So over has to do with above and across. Now above is one image schema, which has to do with, you have to have a vertical orientation, and 2 points on that vertical orientation, one of which is what's called a landmark. We'll talk about how that's done neurally in a minute. And the other is the point that you're looking at, that's over. Across is much trickier. To do across, you need to have a topographic map with regions, 3 regions. 2 regions here and a region in between, and then you have to have a path that binds to the two, has the source in one region to the other, the goal in the other region, and it has to go across that middle region. Okay? And the thing that you're going across is called a landmark. Well, what the hell is a landmark? How does the brain do landmarks versus what is called a trajector of what the thing that's above or the thing that's going across? You know, how does that work? Well, early on in the brain, there's a separation between what is called the what pathway and the where pathway. That is, in lower level visual cognition, there's a separation based on shading and shape that together separate out a background from a foreground. And they process the foreground in one part of the brain and the background in another. Okay? And then later on, after you do a whole bunch of processing in the brain, they're brought together. Actually, they're brought together at various points, but they're brought together. And the background is called, it's the background. The other is there's a figure versus a ground. The figure is sometimes called a trajector. It's what moves. and the background is the landmark, what it moves with respect to. And it actually moves with respect to some region, and there's some element that determines that region that's near it, that's the landmark. More complicated. It's actually another circuit that does that. When they're brought together, you get a relationship like above and a relationship like across from these complex things. And then you have to bind the above part to the across part via neural circuitry that does binding. Right? That's complicated. And that's just across. And you have above and across together, and that's like walk over the bridge. But then there are metaphorical cases, like my favorite is do it over but don't overdo it. Or look over the manuscript but don't overlook anything. Okay? So let's look at those cases for a moment and see what's going on. When you say do it over, that has to do with a general metaphor that is action is motion. You understand actions in terms of motions from one thing to another. And the goal of an action, reaching a goal, is hitting a destination you're trying to reach. So then I won't go through all of this. There's a chapter in a book called Philosophy in the Flesh, chapter 11, has 80 pages describing this in ridiculous detail. So you have action as motion, and what's happening there is that action is understood as moving from one to another, and then when you repeat something, you're going over the same path, the metaphorical path you had before, which is doing it over. Okay? So that's what's going on with what's called the particle over. In grammar, that's called a particle. Now, then overdo it, the over is a prefix. It's at the beginning of the word. And that has to do with linear scales. But what's happening with the linear scale is that the path is upright, vertical, and there is a normal top of the scale, which has to do with the top of a linear scale. But what's a linear scale? Metaphorically, a linear scale is a metaphorical path. You can see this in things like John is far more intelligent than Bill. John's intelligence goes way beyond Bill's. You're understanding linear scales in terms of paths. And the endpoint of a path gets mapped down to the top of a scale. Now, when you overdo something, you go beyond over the top of the scale. So what you're doing is taking the over and you're changing its orientation to here. And when you change the orientation metaphorically to there, you use it as a prefix. Okay? And then there are other things like the play is over, namely you've gone to the end of this action and you're finished and you're there. That turns out to be an adjective in grammar. And so you get different grammatical uses. It can be a preposition, a particle, an adjective, or a prefix with different senses of over. So for example, look over the manuscript. What are you doing? You have a metaphor that seeing is touching, eyes or limbs that go out. It's as if there was a gaze. A gaze is what is the thing that goes out. And when your gaze touches something, you see it. When you're looking it over, you want to make sure your gaze is touching, going over all of these points. That's looking something over. What is it to overlook it? It means when your gaze goes above it and doesn't touch it. So look over the manuscript, but don't overlook anything. Okay? What's going on here is you have different grammars and different combinations, metaphorical combinations. How do you do that in a neural system? Well, the answer to this comes from work of Tony Damasio and Hannah Damasio on what are called convergence and divergence zones. This was worked on initially in 1989, then the grant ran out. They then went and did emotions for a long time and have come back to doing this again. And these zones have to do with cases where you have parts of the brain, like from the phonological part, that go out and cluster in certain places, and then they diverge in other places. That's a convergence-divergence zone from the point of view of the anatomy. But what is the function? You have to say that there's a grammatical function here and a semantic function there. And there are different circuits for that. And each of those circuits is a cascade. So what is happening in this zone? Okay. These things have been modeled by Srini Narayanan, our old friend from who did the work on aspect, And what he pointed out was that you have certain cases in the brain and in physiology, where things like that happen in physiology, where there are what are called coordinating schemas. That is, coordinating nodes. They are nodes that have complicated inputs and complicated outputs, and they sort out that inside the node. How is that possible physically? What is happening in terms of neurons inside there that will give that? Here's what's happening. And this has been actually worked out by the neuroscientists looking at certain clusters of this sort. In fact, the first study was done by Hebb, who first noticed this. When you have a neural ensemble, you have somewhere between a couple of dozen and a couple of hundred neurons that are functioning together to do some job. And they come, and they spread out. They each have 1,000 to 10,000 connections, and they will go to some other place in here, and then they will go to this node. That means you'll have a couple of hundreds of axons and thousands of connections from each of these axons in there. And then inside that, those are going to connect to another bunch of neurons which have a lot of things coming out. And if these things connect crosswise, you will get a coordinating structure that will take a set of inputs and take some inputs to certain conjugate outputs and some to other outputs, and vice versa if it's going in both directions in a cascade. That has been modeled computationally in neural computation by Srini Narayanan. It was actually in his dissertation, which is a completely unreadable monster that I had to read on his dissertation committee, but it's actually there on the web. And hopefully it will be there in the book when he gets the time to finish the other things he's doing for the book. But the modeling has been done, and we know how to do these complex cases where you're doing 100 senses of over with four different grammars, and different ones depending on the grammar. Right? That is the kind of complexity that you have to do if you're doing a theory of how neuroscience works in terms of circuitry. Now, the neuroscientists can't find this out right now. Why? I always get the question, is there an fMRI that shows this? And the answer is no. Why? An fMRI is not a picture of the brain. You have these nice pictures. That's not a picture of the brain. It's a picture of oxygenated to deoxygenated blood, which has a certain ratio. And it turns out that different ratios have different magnetic properties, which is why you have FM for magnetic resonance, in the brain. So these brilliant people who have figured out fMRIs are able to tell the difference in those magnetic properties, in that ratio. But blood is big relative to neurons. And so they're coming in to various places. Now, when you see an fMRI and you have one voxel, as one little pixel, what is that voxel? It is something like, in many cases, let's say, typically 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters cubed. Right? How many neurons are in there? At least 125,000. How many connections is that? Over 1 billion. What is the time course of the fMRI? Between 1 and 5 seconds. What is the time course of firing across neurons? Between 1,000th and 5,000th of a second. So in that single point, a huge amount is going on. And that's connected to lots of other points. There's no way that an fMRI will pick out a circuit that you can see. Can't happen. fMRIs pick out regions where there's lots of stuff happening. And they're very, very useful for that. It's very important to know where there are regions with lots of stuff happening, but mostly they can't pick that out. So it's very important to know that we need to get better technology to do this. Now, will brain mapping work? We are now Obama has proposed a brain mapping project as a European EU brain mapping project. And when you read the popular accounts, you get a very misleading picture. The popular accounts say, well, there are neural networks, and we're going to get those networks as if they were just tubes. We're going to trace all the tubes. And they have beautiful pictures of the neurons and their axons, But then the axons have synapses between them. And there you can see those in the actual pictures. What's happening when these things come together is that there isn't a single tube that goes all the way through. At each point, there's a soup called, which is basically what a synapse is. It's a chemical soup. And you have lots of things coming into this chemical soup and lots of things going out of it. And the way that neural firing works is the following. There are two types of cases. One, which has to do with neurotransmitters, and the other which has to do with charges. So, in general, the outside of a neuron and the axons and the dendrites are made up, have proteins. And when those certain complex proteins are bound or locked, when they're twisted, nothing gets in. To get in, they have to open up. And there are different kinds of proteins that open up in two different ways. One, when there is a neurotransmitter, which is a hormone, like dopamine or something like that, coming in there, which allows them to open up. When they open up, a whole lot of sodium ions come in, and maybe potassium ions come out, 3 potassium for 2 sodiums coming in. And when you get a lot of sodiums coming in, you get a charge built up. Well, down the axon, there are other kinds of protein molecules along there that are bent, but those open up in the face when there's a big charge. So if there's a big charge in the center of this thing, and there's a tube down there with all these other protein molecules and lots of sodium around, what will happen is, because of the charge, these guys will open up and they'll let in the sodium ions, which will give you more charge, and the next ones will open up, and the next ones will open up, go all the way down to the end. And at the end of the axon, there are these little extensions. And at the end of each extension, there's a little pod, and that pod contains neurotransmitters. And when the charge goes down to the end, the pods open up, and the neurotransmitters spit out. Okay? And then they go across into the synapse, but there are lots of them going across, forming different functional networks. A functional network is a network drawing that shows you what the function of all these things is, including the course of the ions, the neurotransmitters going across and the ions flowing in. Namely, it's a model, a computational model of how that works. But physically, there's no tubes out there. Okay? But it works. It's incredible. We have that's how the brains actually do it. Now, given that, just think for a minute, think of the awesomeness of the fact that you can reason on the basis of all this stuff connected to your body and connected to each other. You can reason and you have language, and I haven't gone into the structure of grammar that comes out of this. We have a theory of grammar that works with all of these things, that links up the structure of the grammar with the structure of the meaning through the cascades. And what's in between them are the coordinating nodes, which take grammatical structure and then says what kind of semantic structures those grammatical structures can express, because they do. Now, that's the kind of work that's been going on at Berkeley for the past 25 years, along with work on cognitive linguistics and embodied cognition in the fields of neuroscience, neural computation, cognitive linguistics, embodied cognition in 4 different fields. And what we're trying to do over that period is bring them together, and hopefully by next year there will be an introductory book going over what I talked about today with more than I talked about today that will show how the grammar works and so on. But I'm going to stop right now because I want you to have at least some questions. But I wanted to give you a feel for the kind of research being done. And this is actually, literally, the first lecture of this sort. Thank you.
So who has questions? We have time for questions.
Don't be shy. There are no dumb
Yeah,
questions.
it's a big
At any level, please just ask away. It's fine. Yes, hi.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating. Now I would like to just ask about one aspect, and
Sure.
this may be a little bit abstract because I'm a philosopher of mind, and for philosophical purposes this may be more abstract than the concrete details that you were dealing with. But I was wondering if I could get a better handle on the significance of asserting that cognition is embodied in light of the fact that, you know, the way it seems to me that philosophers think about this thing is that, of course, there is something going on in consciousness. Most philosophers will agree that in order for this to be possible, for example, to have color perception, you have to have a certain kind of body with certain kind of sense organs and a certain structure of the brain. So, for example, Descartes, who is not often cited as a friend of embodied cognition, thought that it is not possible for a disembodied mind to have sensory perceptions. He thought that what makes it possible to have the kind of sensory perceptions that we have is to have sense organs. He had drawings about that, which are very famous, and you know, that stuff happens in the brain, and in order to communicate this specific kind of sensation to the disembodied mind, all this is necessary. Now, I myself am not sympathetic to the idea of a Cartesian disembodied mind, but I just wanted to sort of illustrate that even those people who think that a large part of mentality can be independent from the body, totally signed up for the thesis that in order to have, for example, color perception, you have to have certain type of sense organs, certain type of brain, and this is a necessary condition. So I was just wondering that when you were saying at the beginning of the lecture that these people sort of somehow discovered or gave a first evidence for embodied perception by pointing out things about the color terms and the mental imagery. Descartes thinks the same thing about mental imagery. He thinks that there is no mental imagery without the involvement of the brain. Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering, why is that so significant for this abstract philosophical level?
It's very different to say stuff happens than to say how it happens in detail. And what the folks at Berkeley who discovered the circuitry was that they worked out the details of how it happened and what kinds of circuits are necessary, what kinds of color. There were no color cones in Descartes. There were no neural circuits in Descartes. There was no places in the brain where different circuits occurred. They didn't tell you the details of anything. They say, oh yeah, the body's needed, stuff happens. Fine. I mean, take someone like Chomsky who says, well, you know, language is really abstract. It's an abstract mathematical system, but the brain is sort of a general computational system, sort of like hardware for software. It can do anything. Stuff happens. No. It doesn't just happen. It happens in detail, in incredible detail. So the people who've worked out, let's say, letter perception show that what the detail is. The people who work on color show what the detail is. This is not a matter of just saying, oh, somehow it works, but now we'll talk vaguely. You know, philosophy right now is, so far as I can tell, in many of the cases, not all, they're very well-informed philosophers, but many are like decades behind the times.
But can I just...
No, please. No, please continue.
Just for one, I said, so I'm a philosopher of mind and I'm very interested in empirical work. How is my understanding of the nature of cognition is going to change if I study these things in great detail? I mean, what is the essential insight that I'm going to gain?
You're going to learn that people think in terms of image schemas, which are embodied in a certain way, metaphors, but not random image schemas, particular ones that are universal. You're going to learn frame structure, and then that people don't think in terms of formal logic, that formal logic is inadequate for this, that they think in terms of particular frames, that metaphors are mappings from schema to schema and frame to frame of a particular kind of structure, very particular, that there are hierarchies of metaphors that are very complicated for any concepts, and that all concepts are embodied. And when you have a concept, you don't just say, let there be a concept. There is a concept, blah, government. Let there be the concept government. We write down the word government and it means government. No. You have to understand all that's involved. You write down democracy and it means democracy? No. You have to have the understandings, the multiple understandings of democracy, freedom, government. All of those things have complicated structures. And most of them involve frames and metaphors and image schemas. And then to get those right, you have to understand how they're embodied and how the embodiment comes together to give you what appear to be purely abstract structures, but actually happen. What is abstraction? Abstraction occurs when you have metaphors that have mappings from here to here and here to here that are embodied. You put them together, and this metaphor doesn't use that embodiment, this doesn't use that. When you bind them, you get a concept that is multiply embodied, but isn't embodied in one way. It's embodied, let's say in this case, in 4 ways, maybe 12 ways at once, so much so that you have to do an analysis to trace all the ways they're embodied to show you how you get a meaning out of your body, right? So as a philosopher, you should say, oh, we have to do serious analysis to show in each case what is the structure of the concept and the neural structure that will tell us how we get meaning out of the body. That's the question in detail for case after case after case. That's very different from any philosophical analysis that works now. Now, Mark Johnson is a philosopher. I worked with him very closely. We did a book called Philosophy in the Flesh. The first half goes through the concepts that philosophers normally talk about. What are they? They are time, events, causation, the mind, the self, morality, being, and so on. And we show that each of those are multiply metaphoric, and we go through the details of that analysis. Then we go and say, okay, let's look at particular philosophers. We start with the pre-Socratics and work up to Oxford philosophy, and we show that in each case, certain philosophers pick certain metaphors and take them literally, and then work out the entailments very, very carefully. You know, whether it's Descartes or Kant or, you know, various kinds of Oxford philosophers or somebody like Quine. Okay, what we show is that every philosophy takes a set of metaphors literally and then works them out. And then, very often, they say there's no metaphor. There's no metaphorical thought because they're taking them literally. You know, that would change philosophy because it would say, look at the way in which the unconscious mind does incredible things and has an effect on politics. Last night was about politics, you know, and how this works for politics. But it's not just politics. It's all of social life. It's moral life. It's all of interpersonal life. All of it has to do with those kinds of structures. Okay?
I think Mr. Coulson, how does the brain deal with this when you have more than one language in the brain, etc.?
Thank you very much for this question, because that was the substance of the first lecture on this by Leonard Talmy in 1975, who had looked not at Hungarian but at Russian and at French and Dutch and so on. And they're very different in different languages, and you would have to use, in English, you happen to be able to use the same word, but in other languages, that word isn't there. The word over with that meaning doesn't occur in most languages in the world. And that's very, very common. What you're doing is putting together the elements, the same elements, and the same versions of those metaphors, but they combine in different ways in different languages. And what allows them to combine is circuits that are cascades that have different coordinating nodes, linking them to different words and different grammars.
But how does the brain deal with that, let's say, with people who've got more than one mother language? Let's say, if you learn a language in an early age, it's a mother tongue, and there are people, let's say, who have two.
Well, first, there are things we know and things we don't know about that. One of the things that appears to be true is that the same elements are there. You know, you have containers, you have paths, you have, you know, and the notions of neural binding are the same, but the combinations are different in different languages, and the words are different. And so you have different circuitry linking the embodied parts to the parts that are different in different languages. And The ones you learn early they're kind of fixed, and the other ones are learned in another way, in a different part of the brain often. But I don't know how that works, and I don't know if anybody else knows about that second language learning in that level of detail. People who study the second language learning can tell, yes, the second language is learned elsewhere in the brain in terms of its phonological forms and its words, but they don't look at the circuits linking them to the meaning, and so on. They usually don't ask that question. So in terms of the detailed answer, I don't know, and no one else does. In terms of the basic answer, how you can translate from one to another, the answer is you're going through the primary embodiment.
All right, you have another question?
Yes.
So I was wondering how an embodied account of the mind can account for certain neuropsychological states, for example, semantic dementia or apraxia, where the sensory and the conceptual system seem to be separated. So for example, in apraxia, patients are unable to perform actions with tools, using their hands. So for example, to drive a nail in with a hammer. But at the same time, their conceptual, their notion of a hammer and its semantic use in language is not in any way impaired. And the other way around also true, it's possible to lose the conceptual notion of certain concepts, but at the same time in semantic dementia, but at the same time retain every general sensory motor skill that is available to a healthy individual.
Great question. Let's go through the details, because the details are what matter. First, let's take a look at motor skills. The way motor skills work is you have a motor, motor cortex, primary motor cortex here, premotor and cortex here. You have connections between them. Now, in the premotor cortex, you have circuits that coordinate and are connected to motor neurons here. The motor neurons here can only do certain things. They're connected to the body through the neck and then down into the spine. So for example, when you're asleep and you're dreaming, in a normal person, this is blocked off. But if you have a certain disease, you don't block it off, and you start running in bed when you are running in your dream. Okay, this creates all kinds of marital problems. Now, but you have these connections to your body, and then you have connections back with feedback to know if you've done it and successfully. So you're constantly going in both directions, adjusting that. But it's got to go down from here to here to here to your body, and it's got to have a coordinating schema over here for this. And then there are things about deciding what schemas come together, which is from the forebrain to here. So you've got decision making about what you're about to do. If I decide to take a glass of water, it's got to go from here to here to here to here, all the way down. Now you can have impairments in many places, and you also have to have things that connect to the phonology and the grammar. And the phonology and the grammar is mostly a very complicated structure here that then links to other things in the brain. Very complicated. For those of you who are as you get older, there are a lot of young people in this audience, I want to warn you, when you hit about the age of 50 or maybe earlier, you start to forget the words for things and people's names. And it's not because of dementia. It's because the connections here, we evolved to live to about 40. If you live beyond that, you got the following problem. The connections here form a knot, and there is electrical interference between the names. So that means you know too much. So if you live long enough to know too much, you will start forgetting words and names. Look forward to it. So what's happening is you can have problems in your brain. You can have lesions in all sorts of places. And those lesions can disconnect the semantics while keeping the ability to do the skills, and vice versa. So the question is, where are the lesions? You have that kind of those kinds of complex connections. Lesions in one place do one thing, lesions in another place do another thing. There's a classic study by Damasio on this sort of thing. When he first read about basic level concepts, he said, aha, this explains the following. There are patients who have one kind of lesion where they can recognize elephants but not cats. And others can recognize cats but not elephants. What is going on? And the answer is very interesting. The ones with the lesions that cannot recognize cats have lesions near the motor regions. And the ones who have the problems with the elephants have lesions near the visual regions. What's going on? Well, when you learn about cats, one of the things you learn is petting. Right? You don't learn, you have a motor skill for interacting with cats that is crucial to the motor programs needed for a basic level concept. So the concept of cat requires the petting. But the concept of elephant in this culture, and especially in America, but not in India, for example, you do not have a motor program for dealing with elephants. You only have a mental image of an elephant, which is in the visual system. So impairments there will impair elephants but not cats, where the petting will be retained, and vice versa. Double dissociation, right? That is a very common kind of double dissociation. And the point is that you have cascades that go throughout the brain. And you can have impairments in various places. Okay? Great.
All right, I think it's...
One more?
One last question, yeah.
The question is let me translate it into other forms. The question, as I understand it, is if you take a look at what is called the ontology of these things, ontology has to do with entities, and the entities can be abstract entities or actions or whatever. Metaphors involve mappings from one ontology to another. That's, Then you say, are there constraints on those? And there are all sorts of very interesting constraints on those. Let me give you, and that they are predicted by a neural theory, and they were mysterious until we had a neural theory. Let me give you an example. Suppose I say, I gave him that idea. I didn't lose it. But if I gave him the book, I no longer have it. Right? Now, what is going on? Why isn't everything about giving mapped onto ideas? And the answer is very simple. The answer comes from the neural theory because you're activating the source and target together and you're moving in both directions. You know certain things about the target. You know when you tell somebody something, you still know it. And that means that the part of losing it cannot map. That is, there is no connection that's possible there. And as a result, that part of the metaphor isn't used. It's partial. So partiality has to do with the possibility of the mapping, and that is normal. You have what are called target domain overrides, which are simply neural cases where neural connections can't be made. Okay? And that again was discovered by Srini Narayanan in his dissertation. Right. But what happened was he worked out the neural theory of metaphor and then showed that that was a consequence of it.
Okay, I think we have to end here. Thank you very much again.
Yeah, thanks.